Okay, so welcome. I'm Don Brower. I'm at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the CI Compass webinar series. So CI Compass is an NSF Center for Cyber Excellence. And through this webinar series, we hope to present on topics current to cyber infrastructure practices, the data lifecycle, and encourage the cross-pollination of ideas between major facilities and data professionals. So our speakers today are Amanda French, who is a technical community manager for ROAR, the Research Organization Registry. She's been involved with libraries and e-research for many years and working on many projects, such as the COVID tracking project. She has a PhD in English from the University of Virginia, so that's nice. And then also Ted Habermann is the co-founder of Metadata Game Changers, and he's working closely with many data site members and data site and on the DataCite metadata working group. He's worked on metadata information systems over the years at many places such as NOAA, NASA, USGS, and the HDF group. He has a PhD in geology from UC Boulder. So thanks. So I'm happy to turn the presentation now over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Don. Thank you all for having us. As you mentioned, Don, I am Dr. Amanda French, and I am the Technical Community Manager for the Research Organization Registry. And ROAR is an initiative jointly operated by Crossref, DataCite, and the California Digital Library. Some kind of, excuse me. So I actually am based at Crossref, which, as you likely know, is a registration agency for DOIs, digital object identifiers. And I work there to help promote the use of ROAR in the global research information community. I also want to take this opportunity to say, I believe in science. I believe in the overall scholarly, scientific, and research endeavor. I think the work that federal agencies like NSF do is crucially important. And I think that the contribution of research facilities to the research endeavor should, in particular, be more widely recognized. And we think and hope that ROAR, the Research Organization Registry, can help with that. So what is ROAR? As you can see here, ROAR, the Research Organization Registry, usually referred to by its acronym, which rhymes with the lion's roar, is a global community-led registry of open, persistent identifiers for research organizations that's becoming a global standard. As you may know, a persistent identifier is a digital identifier that is globally unique, machine resolvable, and persistent, meaning as permanent as human beings can make them. Importantly, a true persistent identifier, such as ROAR, also has rich associated metadata that can be retrieved using only the identifier. And of course, this is true for DOIs as well. It's not only the identifier that we're concerned with, but everything that's associated with that identifier. ROAR makes information about research organizations clean, consistent, normalized, and easy to exchange among software systems so that journal articles, data sets, and other research outputs can be reliably associated with any kind of research organizations of many different kinds, including research facilities. ROAR is the only research organization identifier that is free of cost, open, and community-led. So, even if you haven't heard of ROAR, which you may have, I'm sure you've heard of DOIs and of ORCIDs. Of course, both ORCID IDs and DOIs are also persistent identifiers. An ORCID ID identifies a researcher, a DOI identifies a research output, such as a journal article or a data set, and a ROAR ID identifies an organization associated with the research, such as the organization where the researcher is employed, also known as the researcher's affiliation, or a funding organization that funds the research. Many other kinds of organizations as well, but those are two typical examples. So here's a sample ROAR record. So this record should make it clear that the ROAR ID, like the ORCID and the DOI, is not just an identifier. The true value of these identifiers is that they are associated with metadata about the entities they identify. So on this record for Virginia Tech, where I worked at one time, you can see the unique ROR ID at the top, a name for the organization, what type of organization it is, and other names it goes by. Those other names include acronyms, any alternative names for the organization, and commonly used names for the organization in various languages. Virginia Tech is one of my favorite examples because when I worked there, of course, the official name of Virginia Tech is Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, but nobody calls it that. People call it Virginia Tech. So in fact, the primary name on this record is Virginia Tech, and then the alternate name is actually the official name. Additional information on this record includes the organization's website, its location, and its mapping to other identifiers. ROR also supports parent-child relationships and sibling relationships for organization, and you can see those here, and we're going to talk more about that later on. This includes labs, hospitals, research centers, and facilities, each of which has its own ROR ID. Note as well in the bottom left that you can see the record's last modified date, as well as links to the underlying metadata, and a link to request a change to the record, also very important. If you want to request a change to this record, you can just suggest a change, and then we will review that. And if approved, that will usually be published within about 4 weeks. We publish entire new versions of the registry, usually twice a month. I think we're having some technical difficulties today trying to publish the latest one, but those updates are reviewed and published with dispatch. ROR currently includes over 113,000 research organizations from around the world, with new records continually being added and existing records continually being updated. This image is taken from the ROR browser search, but all the information shown here, plus some additional information, is also available as JSON in the free ROR REST API, and as both JSON and CSV in the free open downloadable dataset. Both the ROR API and the dataset are entirely open, they are public domain, and they are free to use. And that's thanks to the support of Crossref DataCite and California Digital Library. So the problem ROR was created to solve is illustrated here. Organizations go by different names. And even when they don't go by different names, when people are typing into free text fields, they will tend to type different versions of that organization's name, sometimes vastly different versions. When systems store organization names as text, it becomes difficult to associate research outputs with organizations, including researcher affiliations and funders. So here, this is a search system that shall remain nameless, and you get entirely different results depending on which version of Virginia Tech's name you search by. One of the main things ROR does, not the only thing, but one of the main things is to associate these variant names, these textual names, with a single identifier and that identifier's associated metadata, such as its location and its website. So as in these ORCID records, you can see that the researchers are using vastly different versions of their affiliation name, but ORCID itself, which is a heavy user of ROR, can associate both of those with a single identifier, a single location, and a single website for that organization, which is drawn from ROR. So how does ROR work? This is one typical way that ROR is used. ROR is built into a system, which can then share ROR IDs with other systems. ROR is infrastructure for infrastructure, so it's meant to be used behind the scenes in scholarly systems. Most of the time, individual researchers really should never need to know about ROR. And in that respect, ROR is quite different from the ORCID ID and the DOI, although some very astute researchers do know about ROR. Here's a demonstration system we've built to show how ROR can work behind the scenes to power organization lookups or type aheads. This, of course, we're all familiar with this in various forms. You're entering your state, and there's a drop down for the state instead of a free text field, and that's what ROR can provide for organizations. It's just a lookup field where then a user can select something after typing. A person can type any of the common variant names of an organization and then choose the correct organization, since both names are stored in the ROR record and associated with the ROR ID. This results in nice, clean, normalized metadata, which can then be shared with other systems and especially included in DOI metadata, which is really crucial for that associating of research outputs with organizations. And here's a real system, a production system that uses ROR. You might be familiar with the Generalist Data Repository Dryad, which was actually the first ROR adopter, although by no means the only one. On this slide, you're seeing ROR in action, even though you can't see the ROR ID anywhere on the slide. In Dryad, ROR powers both the institutional affiliation lookup, where I can begin to type in Virginia Polytechnic and then choose Virginia Tech, and the granting organization lookup. And I've specifically used for this an NSF research facility, NSF's Noir Lab, mainly because I liked the name of it. It sounds like a very cool place to go. So yes, NSF's Noir Lab has a ROR ID. Research facilities are definitely in scope for ROR, and ROR already includes many NSF facilities, although as I'll discuss more later, and as Ted might mention as well, we can do more work to represent NSF entities in ROR, and we're happy to work with you to do that. Now, since you are cyber infrastructure people, I thought you might like to see a view of the underlying data behind this record. And I won't spend too long on this. You can see, all the things you can see in the web version. You can see in a JSON representation, including the ROR ID itself, the dates this record was created and last modified, and the organizations this facility is related to. They're in the sort of at the top right. That's some of the related organizations to NSF's Noir Lab, including, of course, the parent organization, NSF. We're particularly interested in ROR in comprehensive and accurate representation of organizational hierarchies and relationships for U.S. federal funding agencies. We have been working closely with several of them, probably most closely with the U.S. Department of Energy in particular. And so here you can see, this might even be a bit outdated. This, I think, might be a couple of months old, but these are these are the child organizations for the U.S. Department of Energy. There are lateral organizations as well, but we haven't represented those on this slide. So this is just a visual representation. You can see the children of DOE, you can see the grandchildren, and you can see one grandchild, this D3D National Fusion Facility. That is a facility right there. And as it happens, the deputy director of that DOE facility recognizes the value of ROR and posted this really nice endorsement essentially on LinkedIn a couple of years ago now. But here I think Dr. Pace is really expressing the value of ROR. These are going to improve our ability to associate research outputs with the family tree of the producing organization, and that's exactly what ROR is for. Oops. So many key systems are already using ROR. This is just a partial list. ROR is the preferred identifier for a lot of key infrastructure, including Crossref and DataCite and ORCID. The Department of Energy also runs a service where it creates DOIs for its related organizations, and they are heavy users of ROR. ROR has been incorporated into Web of Science, into OpenAlex, if you're familiar with that. Repository systems have been very, very quick to adopt ROR. And many of those, not only Dryad, but Zenodo and many other repository systems you might be familiar with are using ROR. Publishing systems have been slower to adopt ROR, but that is, it's getting better every day. And there are a number of large scholarly publishers. Even if you do a submission to Science Journal, their submission forms are using ROR. A lot of publishers are using ROR internally more than sharing it with in DOI metadata, but we know that that's coming. Here's just a little example of, just a nice visual example of a system that is structured around ROR, DataCite Commons. Ted will show you a little bit about this too. But what DataCite Commons does is really beautifully, it uses ROR IDs to show you the works that are associated with this institution, works registered with DataCite that are associated with, in this case, Virginia Tech. Here's another service called OA Report, which is entirely free. And this too is using ROR ID in its infrastructure. Its sort of fundamental architecture relies on ROR to represent an organization. And in this case, what OA Report does is allow you to see which publications from the NSF are open access, or various kinds of open access, or have data availability statements, things like that. It's a nice service. ROR is entirely fair, which, as I know you know, means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. ROR meets the OSTP guidance that was issued in August of 2023, specifically 4C, if you look at that, using unique digital persistent identifiers to all awards and protocols, and that have appropriate metadata linking the funding agency and their awardees. So that funding agency persistent identifier is can be a ROR ID and should be a ROR ID. There are lots of federal agencies that are using ROR now. I mentioned some of our work with the Department of Energy, specifically the Office of Scientific and Technical Information. We've also been doing quite a bit of work, sometimes with other federal agencies, just to represent them correctly in ROR. So we've been working quite closely with the Department of Defense's DTIC, Department of Technical Information, something and something, Smithsonian, USGS, NOAA, NASA, NIH. We've been working quite closely with a particular NIH initiative called GRAY in particular, and then other databases. The Genomes Online Database is an NIH database. So as I mentioned, the Department of Energy's Office of Scientific and Technical Information is using ROR IDs internally and to some extent in DOI metadata as well, both for, as you can see on this slide, affiliations, so author affiliations, and for sponsoring or funding organizations. It's key to DOE's work, OSTI's work. And then this generalist repository ecosystem initiative is a really wonderful initiative out of NIH, whose primary aim is to help make the repositories where NIH-funded researchers deposit, especially their research data, to make sure that those repositories are sharing common standards, so that they all have, common features as well that meet NIH's standards, and ROR was one of those standards. So all of these 7 participating repositories either have adopted ROR or are in the process of doing it. Some of them are in the process of updating their ROR integrations, and NIH is happy with that. And then I just did want to close by mentioning that although there are some existing NSF child agencies and facilities in ROR, we really have never undertaken a comprehensive review of how NSF is represented in ROR, but we would be more than happy to do that. We did actually initiate this, not even because of this presentation, but just in general. We initiated a project to review NSF child organizations. All of our review processes are open on GitHub. So here is one, but we'd be happy to work with NSF to create more of these. We're most likely to reach out to the Directorate of Data Analytics, but because ROR is centrally curated, really any of you can suggest changes yourself using that link that I showed you on ror.org/search, and we can review them and compare them to public information and then publish them as necessary. So that's all from me, and I will hand things over to Ted.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was super informative, and the points that you made about how NSF facilities are currently using RORs and also using DOIs in general is something that I wanted to take off from. My tendency, or the work that I do, is primarily related to working with repositories and organizations to try and increase their or understand their utilization of what I call the global research infrastructure, and hopefully help them understand the benefits of using that infrastructure. And that includes all of the organizations that Amanda mentioned earlier: Crossref, DataCite, ORCID, ROAR, OpenAlex, all kinds of more and more organizations. And the goal is really to create an identified and connected research ecosystem. This is just a sort of a representative schematic of what such a thing might look like. And this is really what we're trying to understand, what we're trying to construct. So Amanda showed a picture of DataCite Commons, and this is another picture. And the important thing about DataCite Commons is that it builds on DataCite and Crossref, ORCID, and ROAR, and other sources to provide sort of an integrated view of connected data sets, journal articles, people, organizations, and other research objects. So DataCite Commons is sort of one of the early tools that's being created to try and take the integrated look across a lot of different data sources and provide a search. You can see the search can be used for works, for people, for organizations, or for repositories. And so you can use DataCite Commons to see how you or your organization look through this global ecosystem lens. And that lens is a complicated lens. It depends, on a number of systems, obviously, and people and organizations. So how data moves through that lens or through that system and comes out on this lens varies, and it's important to understand that. But one thing we can do with DataCite Commons is put ourselves in under people and look at our ORCID data along with things that we're connected to. So it's a different view of us than the ORCID profile, but an interesting one that may, at least whenever I look at my page here, I learn something about how I look. So what about existing DOIs, and where are those DOIs coming from? Amanda mentioned facilities getting RORs. There are 20 major facilities currently have RORs that I was able to find. And when I look at those organizations in DataCite Commons, you can see the names of the organizations on the left and the number of DOIs that they have. IRIS, the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, and UNAVCO are two experienced organizations that have a lot of DOIs. And then it goes down to just a few at the bottom. So where there are opportunities to improve the utilization of RORs, and there's also good examples to learn from. The colors in here are where these DOIs come from. As I said, I searched DataCite Commons to find these connected research organizations. And most of those resources currently associated with these facilities have DOIs minted by DataCite. So they're typically dataset DOIs, and you can see the vast majority of these are datasets. And the benefit of that is that DataCite metadata is owned and controlled by the repositories. It's a little bit different than Crossref. In Crossref, there's between the authors and the system are the journals. And as Amanda said, a lot of journal systems are starting to integrate ROR into those systems. And that's been a great set of progress that we've made. But for DataCite, the repositories actually directly control that metadata. And what that means is they can recurate their metadata. So recurate is a word that I've been using for a little while. We know that when things come into a repository, they get curated, the metadata gets improved, the librarians or the research librarians work with the researchers to try and improve the metadata, get identifiers and things like that. But things change, like RORs come along, other identifiers come along, papers get published that are connected to a data set. Data sets or other research objects might be connected to projects. So it's important for us to have sort of an ongoing process of curation or recuration, and DataCite allows you to do that with your DOIs. So that's a big difference. So looking at these institutions, DataCite and Crossref have a number of different kinds of things that they can identify. And so this is a plot with sort of very colorful and a lot of interesting stuff in here to take a look at. But the main things that we expect are text objects, which is sort of a general kind of resource type in DataCite. Data sets, the blue, certainly used throughout a number of these. Journal articles, mostly coming from Crossref, we see. And we also see some other things that are less commonly used, things like events, things like software. These are collections are used quite a bit by OOI. So the facilities that are exploring DOIs and are doing a lot of different things with those DOIs and a lot of interesting things that we can all learn from. So just to summarize that, data sets make up the vast majority of things that are in DataCite. I've dropped UNAVCO and IRIS out of this because they have over 100,000 data sets. So this picture would be all blue. But so most of the DOIs out there are data sets, and I'll focus sort of on DataCite for the rest of the talk. So DataCite has a number of different resource types, and these are the ones that are most commonly used. We saw that in the picture last, but there's actually one of the nice or interesting things about DataCite, and also nice, is it has a lot of different, it allows you to give DOIs to a lot of different things. So if we think about that connected ecosystem that we're trying to build, we showed the picture of at the beginning. We can connect a lot of different things into it, in addition to data sets that the DataCite is most well known for. And all of these are available to any DataCite member for getting DOIs and making those connections into the overall infrastructure. So there's 4 different ways that these connections can be made. And once again, I'm using DataCite Commons here as sort of the viewer that we're using to look into this infrastructure. The first is to have a repository owned by a facility. So we saw those examples. We saw some examples, IRIS, UNAVCO, NEON, UCAR, are facilities that are DataCite members, and they have repositories. Items that are in those repositories are retrieved by Commons when you search for that repository, regardless of whether or not they have RORs. So it's sort of an implied relationship there. The other one that Amanda talked about is having a creator or an author of a resource that has the facility affiliation and ROR in the metadata. So that's what we're working on with Crossref or other DOI creators or DOI minters to get RORs in with affiliations for those people. Another way, DataCite metadata also includes a number of ways to acknowledge other contributors to a project. One of those ways is a sponsor. And one of the things that we've been exploring is using the sponsor type with the facility ROR to get a connection into DataCite Commons, because I'll talk about sponsors later, but this is an interesting possible way forward. And finally, publishers. Publishers are interesting because they're a required field, and they also show up in the citation. So all 4 of these sort of RORs and RORs in various kinds of research objects can get into Commons. And now there are a couple of things that don't get into Commons that we need to sort of keep in mind. First is resources that go into a repository that's not owned by the facility. Amanda mentioned the Gray initiative and a number of generalist repositories, Dryad, Figshare, Zenodo, Dataverse, etc. Those are repositories that provide DOIs for a lot of researchers. They're used a lot, but if the facility ROR doesn't get into that, into the metadata for that paper or data set or whatever is getting submitted to Zenodo, it's not going to show up in Commons because there's no connection to the repository or to the facility, sorry. A lot of facilities, all facilities essentially, have visitors that come from universities. And they could have teams of researchers that come from universities, do some work, either using instrumentation at the facility or other kinds of support from the facility. Those researchers then go home and publish a paper. And if none of those researchers have an affiliation with the facility, they publish a paper, they might have the RORs for their universities there, but if they don't have some kind of a ROR or maybe a contributor, then they don't show up into Commons. So this is a little bit what I mentioned about the data journeys, the ways that data move through the infrastructure and get viewed in different tools. So we need to understand what gets in and what doesn't, and take advantage of what these paths. So I mentioned recuration, and recuration is this process that we just saw here of adding those RORs into the resources that are in repositories owned by the facility, just to make a more direct connection to the facility and maybe acknowledge them in some way. And so that's what that recuration process is that I mentioned earlier. So there are a number of facilities that currently have data site repositories. This shows, so these are owners, facilities that own their own, their data site members, they own a repository. And some of these, UCAR and UNAVCO and IRIS have been using these repositories for many years. And as you can see, the numbers, they have thousands of research objects in these repositories. So these are things that have DOIs. Most of these are data sets, as we would expect. These are facilities that produce data sets, and you can see that so far, most of these repositories have a lot of opportunity for adding RORs into their data sets. Some of them are exploring RORs, and some of them are in the process of in the beginning of recurating those repositories to try and add identifiers of various kinds. ORCID, say, and RORs. But so we have a lot of resources out there that are sort of floating without being connected, that we can work on and connect. And just wanted to mention once again, Data Site Commons. It's an interesting tool, and in this case, it allows you to view these data site repositories and related works using the Commons for searching for the organization names. So what about data site affiliations? How do these get into data sets? So there's, as Amanda mentioned, there's the DOI, there's metadata for it. There's creators or contributors, and these are people, so they're personal type. And they have an affiliation with the university or facility or other kind of organization. And the ROR for that goes into the metadata. So that's this is really the most common way that we see of getting RORs into the metadata. The second one is organizations. DataSite can also have organizational parties that are responsible for things, and those organizations directly get a ROR as a name identifier. So these are the ways that we get the RORs into the metadata, associating them with people or organizations. So here's an example. There's a document that many facilities participated in, the major facilities cloud use cases and considerations. And this is what the people look like in those in the metadata for that document. So this is Chad, who many of you know from IRIS. And IRIS has merged with UNAVCO to form EarthScope at this point. So he's got the EarthScope ROR in the metadata for Chad. Brian Dobbins at NCAR, also a contributing author to this in the same way, has the ROR for NCAR in this metadata. And Jeff Gladstein has the ROR for the Ocean Observatories Initiative. So these are creators in the document, in the metadata with their RORs. And of course, many of the people that work at repositories also have affiliations with universities or research institutions that are affiliated with either federal agencies, as in this case, or universities. So authors can have multiple affiliations, many do, and they can add RORs for all of those into the metadata. I talked a little bit about contributor types, and these are the contributor types that the dataset metadata schema supports, in addition to those creators, which are authors. And there's two that are important here that I mentioned earlier. I was going to say something about. The first is hosting institution. So the definition of the hosting institution is the university or research center or organization, or where the data center or data repository belongs. So for data sets that are hosted somewhere, this is a way of acknowledging those institutions that are running those repositories. Many times the facilities or universities they're associated with. And in some cases, you might, an organization like IRIS or Earthscope might have some data sets that are hosted somewhere else, but that they manage and make available the metadata for. So in those situations, hosting institution gives you a way to acknowledge those other facilities or other institutions that might be providing support for a data set. Sponsors are also important. Many of us get sponsor and funder confused in DataCite. One of the important distinctions is that funders provide financial support and sponsors provide in-kind support, like instrumentation or a facility kind of support. There's a lot of different ways that facilities provide support. So even if they're not providing money, or not providing financial support, they can also be acknowledged for helping to make that research possible. Finally, publisher is an interesting one because publishers appears, the name of the publisher appears in a citation. And it's also a required field. So every DOI that's in DataCite has a publisher. And just recently, actually January of last year, so for about a year, the ability to give identifiers, RORs typically, to publishers has been added to DataCite. And so DataCite, the metadata has evolved quite a bit over the years, and this edition was done specifically so that we could get RORs in for those publishers and acknowledge their contributions. So going back to the network that we're trying to build, this is once again that schematic, and I hope that now you sort of have an idea that facilities can go in here as organizations that are associated with researchers, and they can also be things here like a field station, which is a special kind of facility or one kind of facility that provides a lot of research support. And here we're connecting that field station as a sponsor to a project metadata record. So projects are really important, and they're being used. They are a resource type that exists in DataCite, and they're being used by there's over 100,000 projects already in DataCite. So using that, getting a DOI for a project that you can connect all these things to is interesting and exciting new sort of capability. Connecting to articles is also important. Most of this was mentioned by Amanda because this is really the publication side. Articles can be connected to data sets and to software and to many of the other kinds of research outputs that we mentioned. But the American Geophysical Union, who is published by Wiley, has done a lot of work on this of how to get these citations into the articles for either data sets or software. This is citations are something that publishers and systems know how to deal with. So getting the acknowledgement or the connected data sets and software and other kinds of resources as well into those citations is an important way of trying to get them into the system. So that is the end of my talk, and I think we have plenty of time for questions. I think these slides will be available, and so after these regular slides, there's also some pictures that like I'm a pictorial kind of guy. So these are some pictures of some resources from facilities and how they're connected to various kinds of things. So those are in the slide deck that I assume we'll share somehow. And I'll get back now to everybody else.
All right. Yes, thanks. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Ted.